My greedy stepfather is demanding that I give him my late father's house because my mother told him he could. I, 31 years old, have a stepfather whom my mother married a year after my father passed away. I felt uncomfortable seeing my mother fall in love with another man so quickly. I never thought anything of it until my mother and I found out that my father didn't leave my mom anything in his will. Instead, all of his assets and his beach home were under my name. My father left me a letter and I ended up reading it, finding out things I wish I never knew. My father, who was sick at that time, found out that my mother was having an affair with another man. He told me that he had suspected it for a long time, ever since they found out that he had cancer. Since then, my mother became distant. He told me that my mother would constantly ask about his will and would remind him that she would take care of the beach house when he passed away. My father was heartbroken, and he spent the last few days of his life next to someone unfaithful. When I read the letter, I couldn't help but break down crying in my room. I wish I had been there for my father. The more I cried, the more I felt anger and hatred for my mother and my stepfather. When my mother found out that she was left with nothing, she started flipping tables and screaming, asking why she wasn't left with anything. It was clear that my mother only cared about my father's assets, not him. I decided to leave my hometown and cut ties with my mother and her new husband. I moved to my father's beach house, where I would try to start over. I've always worked from home, so moving to another area was never a problem. It wasn't until recently that I got a text message from my stepfather. He asked me how I was doing, and I didn't respond. He texted again, and he was more straightforward. He told me that I needed to move out of the beach house because he and my mother would be moving in. But if I wanted to stay, I could pay them rent for my room. I looked at the text completely speechless, not knowing if he was bluffing or serious. I told him that the house was under my name and that I would call the cops if they ever set foot inside my home. He never responded afterwards. I thought that was the end of it, until a couple of weeks later when I got a notification on my phone while I was out grocery shopping that there was motion near my driveway. I opened the app and saw both my stepfather and mother stepping out of their vehicle as they continued to unpack their belongings. My heart sank, and I immediately felt anger inside me. I decided to call the cops ahead of time and told them that I had people trespassing on my property. By the time I arrived, the cops were already there. Now you can watch part 2 by pressing share and then more. Part 2, my greedy stepfather is demanding that I give him my late father's house because my mother told him he could. The cops were there. My mother and stepfather were unloading boxes from their car. I asked, "What's going on here?" My voice shook with anger. "We're moving in," my stepfather said smugly. "This is our home too." "This house is in my name. You have no right to be here," I responded. The officers stepped in, separating us as the argument heated up. One officer asked me to explain what was happening. I showed him the documents proving the house was mine and my father's will. My mother tried to interrupt. "He's lying. This is a family home." The officer turned to her. "Ma'am, according to these documents, your son is the legal owner. You can't stay here without his permission." My mother turned red with anger. "We have nowhere else to go." "You should have thought of that before," I said firmly. "You were only after Dad's assets. It's not going to happen." The police concluded that my mother and stepfather were trespassing. They were told to leave immediately. Reluctantly, they packed up their belongings and drove away. After they left, they began calling me non-stop, trying to persuade me to let them move in or give them money. I took them to court. The court granted me a restraining order, finally giving me the peace I needed. I spent the next few days redecorating the beach house. Right now, there have been no interventions by them so far, and I am living peacefully in the beach house.